Hey y'all, it's Justin here from Nintendo Watcher, and I'm back with a new video from our Last Days of series. Today, we're looking at the last days of the Super Nintendo. In 1989, Sega beat Nintendo to the 16-bit punch with the Sega Genesis. Nintendo's response to the Genesis wouldn't arrive on store shelves until 1991. Despite its late arrival, the Super Nintendo, also known as the Super NES, which nobody ever called it, went on to become the best-selling console of the 16-bit generation. Maybe with the help of this familiar face. The Super Nintendo was home to some of the most beloved games ever. Super Mario World, Street Fighter II, A Link to the Past, Donkey Kong Country, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, just to name a few. But today, we're not talking about any of those games. Instead, we're gonna look at the handful of games that came right at the end of the console's lifespan. I like to think of these games as the Twilight games, coming out right at the end. These were the games that were released right around the time of the Nintendo 64 or just after. Every console has games like these late licensed titles that a lot of people miss because they're on to the next generation. Before we jump in the comments below, let me know about your favorite Super Nintendo game. Is it an early one, mid, late? Let me know. And if you like Nintendo content like this, consider subscribing and liking the video. It would mean a lot to me personally, and it really helps our new channel grow. All right, let's get to it. Here are the big 7 games for me that marked the last days of the Super Nintendo.
Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, released May 1996. In the late 80s and early 90s, Square might as well have been a Nintendo studio. The Super Nintendo was the golden age of Square and Nintendo's relationship. But even though the two companies were close, Square developing a Mario game still seems weird. But that's exactly what they did. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars was released in May 1996 in North America, just a few months before Nintendo released the Nintendo 64. The game plays out like any other Square RPG, but you're playing with Mario characters. You start with Mario and can add 4 additional characters to your party, including the King of the Koopas himself, Bowser. The combat is a turn-based system that lets you attack, defend, run, or use an item. During combat, Super Mario RPG uses a timed button press mechanic to make attacks more powerful. This mechanic would become a familiar part of future Mario RPGs. Even though we never got a sequel to Super Mario RPG from Square, this game paved the way for the Mario & Luigi series and the Paper Mario series. This is, without a doubt, one of my favorite Super Nintendo games ever, and that's why I had to include it on this list. Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, released in November 1996. Rare went 3 for 3 with the Donkey Kong Country franchise on the Super Nintendo. Donkey Kong Country 3 was released in November 1996 to huge critical acclaim. You play as Dixie and her toddler cousin Kiddy Kong as they go on an adventure to save Donkey and Diddy. Dixie has a unique helicopter spin that lets you kind of hover in midair, super useful for some of the game's more tricky platforming. Like the other games in the series, Donkey Kong Country 3 used pre-rendered 3D animations to make the game's graphics really pop and look like nothing else on the Super Nintendo. The game took everything that made the first 2 Donkey Kong Country games great and amped it up. The graphics are more detailed, the controls feel tighter, and the levels represent some of the most creative platforming you'll find on the console. If you're a fan of challenging 2D platforming, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie's Double Trouble is definitely worth your time, especially if you missed it back in 1996. Harvest Moon, released June 1997. This is it. This is where it all began, back in June 1997 on the Super Nintendo. This is the very first game in the Harvest Moon franchise. Like other games in the franchise, you inherit a farm from your granddad, and your job is to restore it. It's in disrepair. Like any other farming sim, you choose which task you want to do throughout the day and how you want to spend your time. It all seems so familiar now that we have literally dozens of Harvest Moon games, spin-offs, and imitations, But this is where it all got started. Raising livestock, growing crops, building up a town, marrying non-playable characters. It all got its start right here on the Super Nintendo. And not long after its release, Harvest Moon GB was released for the Game Boy. And it's amazing how similar these two games are. I covered that one in my Last Days of the Game Boy video. I'll link it here. Madden NFL 98, released November 1997. From the late 90s on, there's one thing you can always depend on: a Madden game coming out every single year, even for old consoles. From the Super Nintendo forward, the Madden games were almost always some of the very last licensed games released for a console late in its life. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on the channel before, but I'm terrible at football games, and you can probably tell from my gameplay footage here. I understand what I need to do, but my brain and my fingers just don't communicate after the snap, so I end up turning the ball over every time. Another thing I do is just go for it. 4th and 20? Yeah, let's give it a shot. Anyway, I'm not very good at Madden NFL 1998 either, but the gameplay is just like you'd expect it would. It's amazing how little these games have changed over the years. You can play single games or as a complete season. It also has all the licensed teams from 1998. My beloved Tennessee Titans didn't exist yet, so I went with the Panthers. One really cool thing that I appreciate from these games is going back and replaying the old Super Bowls from previous series. Kirby's Dreamland 3, released November 1997. Listen, I am not the biggest Kirby fan ever, but wow, Kirby's Dreamland 3 looks amazing on the Super Nintendo. Just aesthetically, Dreamland 3 offers you pretty much everything you're looking for from a side-scrolling Kirby game. I had a lot of fun playing this one again for the gameplay footage. I ended up playing a lot longer than I expected. The game gives you all the abilities that you'd expect, like your capture ability. The levels are pretty long and varied. Like any other Kirby game, it's not all that challenging though. You can finish it in a few hours. Finding all the secrets though, that's gonna take some time. Playing it now, the controls do feel a little stiff. I don't remember that being an issue when I rented the game back in the day, but it's definitely there for me now. Kirby's Dreamland 3 is a really solid Kirby game on the Super Nintendo, and it might be the best of the Dreamland series. I don't know, what do you think? Any big Kirby fans out there? Let me know in the comments if you think there's a better 2D Kirby game than this one. Frogger, released October 1998. Frogger is the game you know and you love. You're crossing the street and jumping from lily pad to lily pad while you're avoiding crocodiles and trying to time your jumps. The logs, lily pads, cars, and time mechanic are all the same from the original Konami arcade classic, but this version on the Super Nintendo just gives everything a new coat of paint. This Frogger game isn't offering you much more than what we've already seen in the past. At this point, there were so many different ways to play Frogger. Frogger had already been ported to the Commodore 64, Apple II, ColecoVision, Atari, before this 1998 version for the Super Nintendo, but this is the one that I played a lot of in the late 90s. I can't even tell you why I played so much of this game. It was just one of those cartridges that was hanging around, that had a fun arcadey feel. You could replay it a million times to try to get a higher score. I really liked it back in the day. It's a simple game with a simple premise, but it looks better than it ever has before. You might not be able to tell from the gameplay footage here, but the controls for this one are really, really tight. That awesome Super Nintendo D-pad really comes in handy for Frogger. Star Fox 2, released September 2017. I had to add one last bonus game to the list. Technically, the very last licensed Super Nintendo game ever. Star Fox 2. Star Fox 2 was actually completed and ready to go back in 1995, but Nintendo shelved it choosing to incorporate some of the ideas from Star Fox 2 into the upcoming Star Fox 64 for the Nintendo 64. At the time, Nintendo was worried that the graphics in Star Fox 2 wouldn't hold up against the PlayStation and the Saturn, consoles with true 3D power. The game didn't release until September 2017 when the game was included on the Super NES Classic. Personally, I think Nintendo did the right thing by canceling Star Fox 2 in 1995. Playing it now with its early 3D polygons and rough gameplay is more of a curiosity than a must-play. If you didn't get your hands on one of those Super NES classics back in 2017, you can probably still find one now, or you can play Star Fox 2 on the Nintendo Switch Online.
And that's my list. 7 games that marked the last days of the Super Nintendo. Which late games were your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing.